The strike hit just before midnight. 3 Iranian nuclear sites obliterated. The world paused. But Washington trembled, not from the missiles, but from what came after. Behind closed doors, off camera and off script, the president muttered just 7 words. "We hit them hard. Should boost the polls." He thought the mic was off. It wasn't. By sunrise, America wasn't just talking about war. It was questioning the very soul of its democracy. And in that silence stood one voice, unshaken. She didn't yell. She didn't blink. She asked what no one else dared. Was this war about votes? What follows is a dramatized retelling rooted in fact, powered by outrage and driven by a truth no longer whispering. This isn't just a story about AOC or Trump. This is about the microphone that stayed on and the country that finally listened. Welcome to Mix Still On. Stay, watch, share. Because the next line might be yours. 11:46 p.m. The world blinked. 3 coordinated strikes, 3 nuclear facilities, 1 signature. In less than 4 minutes, Iran's Fordow, Isfahan, and Natanz installations became craters of molten steel and crumbling ambition. The bombs didn't just land. They sliced through decades of diplomacy in one breathless sweep. Across Tehran, air raid sirens howled like ancestral ghosts. In Dubai, oil markets surged before traders could even finish their coffee. And in Washington, every cable network banner screamed some version of the same line. Breaking U.S. strikes Iranian nuclear sites. No briefing, no forewarning, no mention of Congress. On the East Coast, while war analysts and ex-generals raced to fill airspace with speculations, the man behind the order stood in silence under studio lights, stage makeup still fresh. President Donald J. Trump, dressed in a navy blue suit that swallowed the room, had just wrapped his pre-recorded address. It was pre-written, deliberate, vague. This was not war. This was protection. But that wasn't the sound that would rock the Republic. Behind the cameras, the crew began to disband. Studio assistants disconnected cables. The director tapped her earpiece and nodded. That's a wrap. J.D. Evans, the ever-controlled vice president, leaned in for a final word before stepping away to his press team. And then Trump paused, half lit, half shadow, alone for a moment in the hallway behind the set. No podium, no filters. Just a man who believed the show was over. He adjusted his cuffs, glanced down the hall, and then, with an offhand confidence so casual it chilled the air, he muttered to no one in particular. "We hit them hard. Should boost the polls nicely." He smirked as if the dead air itself might laugh along. What he didn't know, what no one in that hallway knew, was that the lapel mic still hummed softly. Not broadcasting live, no, but recording, storing, transmitting quietly into the studio's control system. 15 feet away, behind a frosted glass panel, a junior audio technician named Rachel caught a snippet through her headset. She was just double-checking levels. Nothing serious. Until the waveform spiked. Until her instincts kicked in. Until she heard those 7 words, "Boost the polls nicely," and her hands went cold. At first, she wasn't sure. Maybe she misheard. Maybe it was an out-of-context joke. But context matters when lives are measured in megatons. And context doesn't hide motive, it reveals it. She rewound the feed, listened again, slowed it, boosted clarity, no mistake, no ambiguity. The President of the United States had just linked a military strike to electoral advantage. And he'd done it not in strategy rooms, but in whispers, under studio lights, when he thought no one was listening, but someone had been. Rachel sat motionless, a firestorm building behind her eyes. Did she report it? Flag it? Bury it? Was this above her clearance? Was she now part of a story she didn't sign up for? In her gut, she already knew. Some moments ask for silence. Others demand action. This was the latter. She saved the clip, protected the metadata, and with trembling fingers, she began crafting an anonymous message, one that would reach 3 independent journalists within the hour. Meanwhile, outside that studio, the world still reeled from the blast. Headlines scrolled, experts theorized. But the real explosion, the one with the power to shake not just buildings, but institutions? That hadn't happened yet. It would. And it wouldn't start with a missile. It would start with a microphone. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She didn't even blink for most of it. The soundbite played over and over in her head, not because it was loud, but because it was unmistakable. The way he said it, the smirk baked into the syllables, the sheer casualness of it. We hit them hard, should boost the polls nicely. It wasn't just the words, it was the context, the timing, the war. By 2:07 a.m., she had clipped the audio, stripped identifiers, and uploaded the file to a clean drive. She crafted a single sentence: verify this. You'll know what to do. She sent it to 3 progressive blogs, one of which had once exposed a data breach inside a major pharmaceutical lobby. She signed it with a name that wasn't hers. For a moment, she hovered over the send button. Her career was at stake, maybe more than that. But some truths don't wait for permission. Some moments require risk, not because you're certain, but because you're terrified of what silence makes you complicit in. She clicked send. The first post appeared at 4:12 a.m. on a low-traffic blog titled The Citadel Project. No headline hype, just 15 seconds of audio with one caption. This was never about defense. It spread like a rumor you hope isn't true. Reddit picked it up under our politics, then Twitter. Then something strange happened. Conservatives shared it too. Not to defend, not to deny, just to say, did he really say this? By sunrise, it was viral. Hashtags like #7words, Mike's still on, and Strikegate trended simultaneously. By noon, over 23 million people had listened. Split-screen montages ran nonstop. On MSNBC, anchors used words like constitutional rot and moral rupture. Fox leaned into the out-of-context defense, claiming it was banter or sarcasm or, somehow, misinterpreted patriotism. CNN tried to walk the line but failed. This wasn't a matter of interpretation. This was intent laid bare. But the media was only the beginning. On a commuter train outside Philadelphia, a Vietnam vet scrolled through the clip and quietly removed his "I served" pin from his jacket. In an Atlanta classroom, a civics teacher paused her lesson and played the audio, asking her students, "What is the War Powers Act meant to prevent?" In Boise, a nurse on break wiped her eyes and texted her sister, "He said it like it was campaign strategy, like lives were polling data." These weren't just reactions. They were awakenings. Within hours, artists remixed the clip with historic war speeches. "Ask not what your country can do for you" transitioned into, "We hit them hard, should boost the polls nicely." It was gutting, powerful, impossible to ignore. And amidst it all, one voice remained silent, hers. AOC had seen the clip by 8 a.m. Her staff texted her repeatedly. Reporters were calling. Colleagues were asking what she planned to say. But she didn't rush to speak. She watched, listened, observed how the country was breathing. She wanted to understand the temperature of a nation that had been promised strength and been handed spectacle. Because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't interested in a reaction. She was building a response. This wasn't about party lines. It was about the red line between governance and gamesmanship, and whether anyone still had the courage to defend it. Later that evening, she walked to her window overlooking the Capitol dome, silhouetted in the haze of political tension. The sun was setting, but something far more dangerous was just beginning to rise. She whispered, not to a mic, not to a crowd, but to herself. "If this is true, then we have a duty, not a choice." And the nation waited. The apartment was still, not the kind of stillness that calms, but the kind that amplifies thought. No aides, no calls. Just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in her worn gray hoodie, barefoot on hardwood floors, standing in the hush of her DC living room with a laptop screen casting a cold blue light across her face. The clip had been playing in a loop for nearly an hour. She didn't need more context. She didn't need analysis. She needed silence. Because sometimes the absence of noise is the only way to hear history creaking open. She had seen power abused before. She had seen language weaponized. But there was something about these 7 words, casual, strategic, bone deep in their cynicism, that struck a different nerve. It wasn't just the recklessness of war. It was the cold calculus of timing it for political gain. AOC sat down slowly, the laptop now steady on the coffee table. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands pressed together, not praying, not meditating, but calculating the weight of responsibility. This wasn't a moment for outrage. Outrage was everywhere. This was a moment for resolve. And resolve, she knew, didn't come with applause. It came with risk. The news cycle was already shifting. Every outlet had the clip now. Every anchor had their angle. Some painted her as the natural challenger. Others warned she'd only deepen the divide. She knew what they'd say before they said it, that she was too young, too bold, too dangerous to be right, that she would politicize a crisis. But she also knew something else. They were afraid of her, not because she was wrong. They were afraid because she might not flinch. She whispered aloud, not as a statement, but as recognition. This is it. This is the moment. Not her moment, the country's. She opened her notepad. It wasn't digital. It was a soft, worn moleskin, stained slightly at the corners, pages full of scrawls, strategies, and late-night what-ifs. She flipped past pages that now seemed like the calm before a storm. Then she wrote, slow and deliberate, 3 words that would soon define the weeks ahead. Constitution, intent, integrity. She underlined each one, twice. Outside her window, the Capitol dome stood silent. Inside her chest, a fire began to climb. Not fury, not ego, but duty. She thought of her father, who told her as a child that history wasn't something written by the powerful. It was written by the brave, by the ones who chose the harder path when everyone else followed comfort. He'd once pointed to the U.S. Constitution framed in a small museum and said, every word in there cost someone everything. This, what she was about to walk into, was that kind of moment. The calls began to come in, her chief of staff, 2 senior colleagues, a reporter from the Atlantic. She ignored them all. Not yet, not now. This was the space between the trigger and the headline, the breath before the verdict, and she needed that breath, because once she stepped into the storm, there would be no walking back. She closed the notepad and set it beside the laptop. Then quietly she reached for a small sticky note and pressed it onto her wall above her desk. 3 more words. Not for the cameras, not for the voters, just for her. Say it, loud. Because silence may be strategic, but truth, it demands a voice. And come morning, hers would be heard. The press conference wasn't scheduled. It wasn't even announced. But by 10:03 a.m., the media room on Capitol Hill was standing room only. Word had spread that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was about to speak, not as a party-line Democrat, but as a constitutional purist with nothing to lose and everything to say. She didn't take the podium like a politician. She stepped up like a witness, calm, deliberate, unapologetically certain. The energy in the room was electric, waiting for a soundbite. What they got was something else. She didn't quote the clip. She didn't repeat the president's words. That would be too easy. Instead, she focused on the bigger crime, the crime of intent, of power used not to protect the people, but to manipulate them. She didn't dramatize the moment. She dissected it. This, she said, voice steady but sharp, is not about opinion. It's about obligation. It's about whether we, as elected officials, are going to pretend we didn't hear what we all heard, or whether we are going to do the job the Constitution demands of us when a line has been crossed. Cameras clicked. Anchors scribbled notes. But even through the noise, her tone never wavered. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. The gravity did the work. She turned toward the camera, not just addressing the press, but the people behind it. What we witnessed was not a joke. It was not locker room talk. It was not off the record. It was the casual, calculated linkage of military violence to electoral advantage. That is not just reckless. That is unconstitutional. The room stilled, not in shock, but in recognition. Then she did something few in Congress had dared to do in years. She brought out a small, printed copy of the War Powers Resolution of 1973 and held it up for the cameras. She didn't bury the public in jargon. She made it plain. The War Powers Act exists because no president, Democrat or Republican, has the moral or legal authority to send this nation into armed conflict without congressional oversight. That is not optional. That is law. She pointed to the clause that required the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing armed forces and to remove them within 60 days without congressional authorization. No vote, no consultation, no notice, not even a warning to the American people. And yet, bombs fell, headlines cheered, and somewhere in the shadows of a television studio, our commander-in-chief reduced that decision to a polling strategy. There was no rage in her tone, just clarity, and clarity cuts deeper than anger ever could. She didn't call for impeachment, not yet. What she called for was responsibility, a full investigation, a bipartisan inquiry, a reaffirmation that the Constitution was still more than a relic on display. And just before she stepped away from the mic, she said one line that instantly became the clip of the day, then the week. "We don't get to be a democracy only when it's convenient." The voiceover came from a CNN anchor that evening, her tone both impressed and unsettled. She didn't just call it reckless, she called it illegal. That night, the footage aired on every major network. Pundits debated whether she had overstepped, whether this was strategy or sincerity. But the public saw something different. They saw a young woman standing in the belly of American power, staring down a machine that had normalized war as background noise, and saying, "Not this time." And behind closed doors in offices across the Capitol, staffers from both sides began whispering the same thing. "She's not backing down. Not this time." The backlash wasn't slow. It was calculated, immediate, and surgically precise. Within an hour of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's press conference, the GOP war room had already mobilized. The narrative wasn't about the legality of a presidential strike or the constitutional lines it may have crossed. It was about her. "She's doing it again," one headline read on a conservative blog, "turning tragedy into theater." The comment threads lit up with the usual mix of disdain and denial. But the real shot came not from the fringes, but from the Senate floor. Senator Lindsey Graham took the mic like a veteran actor, returning to a familiar script. He didn't address the War Powers Act. He didn't touch the clip. He didn't need to. Instead, he launched into a well-worn refrain. "We've had enough of these drama sessions," he said with a half-smile that barely masked the disdain underneath. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez has turned accountability into performance art. This is not a courtroom. This is not cable news. This is the real world. And in the real world, our enemies don't wait for permission slips." It was a line designed to provoke, and it worked. Fox News ran it on loop. On the Patriot Hour, a graphic titled "AOC's Anti-American Agenda" flashed across the screen as the host launched into a tirade about millennials trying to rewrite foreign policy with hashtags and feelings. A chyron read, "War or woke? The left's war on strategy." In contrast, MSNBC offered a different lens. That same night, on the 11th hour, a former DOJ official, a lifelong Republican turned constitutional watchdog, spoke calmly but with unmistakable weight. "She's right," he said simply. "Whether you like her politics or not, the War Powers Resolution is not ambiguous. Congress has a role. It was bypassed, and the American people deserve better than backroom strategy sessions followed by careless commentary on polling metrics." The segment went viral, not because it was explosive, but because it was rare. A Republican defending the process, defending accountability, and indirectly defending her. But if AOC felt vindicated, she didn't show it. She didn't post celebratory tweets. She didn't clap back. Instead, she returned to work. Her team released a one-page memo titled, "Questions Congress Must Ask Now." It was direct, nonpartisan, and saturated with civic urgency. It listed not just the 7 words, but the 7 legal precedents they may have violated. Still, the heat was rising. On Capitol Hill, conservative staffers mocked the memo as TikTok legislation. Some GOP reps tweeted photos of themselves with cardboard cutouts of AOC, captioned, "Still not scared." It was juvenile. It was predictable. But it worked for their base. And yet something else was working too. Behind the noise in homes across swing districts and in quiet corners of retired military communities, voters were tuning in, not to pundits, but to the actual footage, the clip, the quote, the quiet conviction in her eyes when she said, We don't get to be a democracy only when it's convenient, because underneath the spin, people still recognize sincerity. And if there's one thing more contagious than scandal, it's truth. And AOC, without shouting, without blinking, had forced the nation to pause, to ask not just, what did he say? But what does it mean if we let this go unchallenged? And that question, once raised, doesn't go away. It only gets louder. The blinds were drawn, phones silenced. Outside, the Capitol loomed under morning haze. But inside Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office, the air was thick with uncertainty. Not fear exactly, but something heavier. Anticipation laced with risk. Purpose pressed against pressure. Her inner circle sat gathered in a tight arc. Chief of staff, legal advisor, comms lead, legislative director. The mood was quiet, but not calm. The headlines were still fresh. Her press conference had gone global. She wasn't just trending. She was tearing through the algorithm like a fire through dry brush. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. Support was growing, but so were threats. "You need to see this," her aide whispered, sliding a printed message across the desk. Another anonymous death threat, the fourth in 2 days. AOC glanced at it and slid it aside without a word. Her comms lead broke the silence. "We need to be smart about this. We've rattled the hornet's nest. The right's already framing this as a publicity stunt. The next move has to be airtight." Her legal advisor leaned forward. "If we move too fast, impeachment talk, resolutions, we risk looking partisan. But if we move too slow, we lose momentum. We look weak." AOC said nothing. Her fingers tapped lightly on her notebook, the one where she had written Constitution, intent, integrity. Finally, her legislative director spoke, voice quieter but heavier than the rest. "They're coming for you now, not just politically, personally. This isn't a policy battle anymore. This is a power war." A moment passed, then another. AOC looked around the room. The people in front of her weren't operatives. They weren't staff. They were believers, people who had signed on not for the spotlight, but for the fight. She sat back slowly and spoke, her voice low, measured, but unmistakably firm. "I didn't run to keep quiet when it gets hard." It wasn't defiance. It was memory of the night she decided to primary a 10-term incumbent, of the insults, the threats, the nights canvassing until her shoes blistered, and the moment she realized that standing up alone was still better than staying seated with everyone else. She leaned forward. "This isn't about me. It never was. It's about what we allow to be normalized. If a president can drop bombs and joke about votes, and the only thing we do is analyze optics, we've already lost more than an election. We've lost the spine of our system." Her comms lead nodded. "So what's the next step?" AOC paused, not for hesitation, but precision. "We don't jump to impeachment. Not yet. We push for hearings, a formal review. We document every timeline, every transcript. We force the country to look, not glance, not skim, but look at what this presidency has done to truth, to power, to trust." She turned to her legal advisor. "We make this airtight, bulletproof, because they're going to throw everything they have at us." And then, as if reading their collective thoughts, she smiled. Not out of ease, but resolve. "They think this is about headlines, but it's about legacy." The room shifted. Nods, focus, energy realigned. Outside, the protesters were gathering again. Some held signs demanding accountability. Others just held silence. But inside, AOC's team was already moving. Emails drafted, meetings scheduled, allies called. Because when power hides behind performance, truth has to speak louder than fear. And in that moment, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a firewall. The hearing room buzzed with tension even before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered. Cameras were already rolling, mics already live. On one side, Republican members of the House Oversight Committee lined up like a wall, arms crossed, brows tight. On the other, Democrats shuffled papers and exchanged glances, some eager, some cautious. But every eye turned when she stepped in. AOC didn't rush to her seat. She moved with precision, measured, steady, as if carrying a truth too heavy to drop. She wore no theatrical expression, no calculated defiance, just quiet certainty, the kind that silences a room without raising a voice. The chairman gavelled the hearing to order. The agenda was routine, but everyone knew why the room was full. This wasn't about reviewing defense contracts. This was about a president's words, a war's purpose, and a mic that refused to go quiet. When it was her turn, AOC didn't unroll a scroll of evidence. She didn't pull out props or graphs. She leaned in, looked straight into the eyes of her colleagues, and asked the one question no one else had dared to ask on record. Is it now acceptable for the commander-in-chief to speak of war as a campaign tool? Silence. No objections. No answers. Just silence. She pressed forward. What precedent are we setting when a president authorizes a military strike without congressional approval and then references polling bumps? Is that leadership, or is that political opportunism cloaked in patriotism? Chairs shifted. Staffers scribbled. The tension climbed. She scanned the room, then locked eyes with a senior GOP member. Are we still the branch that holds power in check, or have we become decorators for executive overreach? That was the moment, a ripple of movement. 4 Republican members stood up, not loudly, not angrily, but deliberately. One leaned into his mic. I won't be part of this circus. Then they walked out, but AOC didn't flinch. She didn't pause. Her voice grew stronger. Walking away from a question doesn't erase its urgency. It proves its weight. She turned back to the remaining members, then to the cameras. Her voice slowed, sharpened. What we heard, those 7 words, were not casual. They were a window into how power sees sacrifice, into how some leaders have stopped asking if a decision is just and only ask if it polls well. Another Republican rose. Left without comment, AOC continued undeterred. When we fail to question motive, we normalize it. When we dismiss intention, we forfeit responsibility. And when we let war be reduced to political calculus, we stain the very fabric of our Constitution. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. And clarity doesn't whisper. It resonates. By the time she finished, over half the Republican seats were empty. But it didn't matter. The people who needed to hear it were watching at home. Veterans with folded flags on their mantles, students learning about checks and balances, families with kids in uniform. One anchor would later say, she didn't just confront the committee, she confronted a culture of silence. And the clip would circulate. Millions would watch. Some would scoff, but many would nod. Not in partisan agreement, but in recognition that someone, at least one voice, had refused to look away. And AOC, she didn't bask in the moment. She simply gathered her notes, rose from her chair, and walked out the way she came in, silent, steady, and already thinking of what needed to be said next. Because for her, this wasn't theater. It was accountability, overdue. The committee room may have emptied, but America was still watching. Within minutes of AOC's House Oversight showdown, clips flooded the airwaves. CNN led with, AOC, war is not a campaign strategy. MSNBC went further. Is this the turning point? Meanwhile, Fox News wasted no time painting the moment as performance art dressed in protester chic. The divide wasn't subtle, it was seismic. On NPR's All Things Considered, a retired Army general said her words echoed something long buried. We used to debate military action. Now it's just press releases. She reminded us of our duty to ask why. But on the Ingram angle, her name was layered with vitriol. This congresswoman doesn't want accountability, the host growled. She wants attention. She wants to be the star of the anti-war stage play. A graphic appeared under her face, AOC, theatrics over tactics. Social media was a battlefield of its own. Hashtags like the mic was still on and Constitution over power trended globally. TikTok stitched her committee speech over protest footage. Instagram feeds pulsed with images of her holding the War Powers Act like a sword. Memes flooded both sides, some mocking, others rallying. On YouTube, conservative creators spliced her into parody skits, turning her rhetorical questions into punchlines. But liberal commentators did the opposite. One rising creator dubbed her the last firewall between democracy and show business. The video passed 1 million views by midnight, and yet beyond the spectacle, something else was happening, something the networks didn't entirely understand. In retirement homes and truck stops, people weren't debating party lines. They were rewatching the mic clip, replaying the hearing, listening, really listening, for the first time in a long time. Not to pundits, but to one voice, unflinching in its demand for constitutional accountability. Meanwhile, the New York Times editorial board dropped a rare weekend column titled, "Who Owns the Power to Declare War?" It didn't mention Trump directly. It didn't praise AOC outright, but the subtext was blistering. We've allowed silence to become a strategy, and now one voice has broken through. By contrast, Newsmax doubled down. One commentator suggested that AOC had compromised national unity. Another accused her of fomenting civil dissent under the guise of oversight. But if she was rattled, she didn't show it. While the internet spun itself into firestorms, AOC returned to her office and did what few in the spotlight ever remember to do. She listened. She met with military families. She reviewed decades of foreign policy precedent. She invited constitutional law scholars to her office, not for sound bites, but for clarity. She didn't want to win the argument. She wanted to win back the process. Still, the noise was deafening. Every hour brought a new wave. Mockery, praise, threats, praise again. Her face became a political Rorschach test. To some, she was a radical threat. To others, a civic hero. But through it all, one truth remained steady. She had made the nation stop scrolling and start paying attention. Because in a media cycle trained to reward outrage, what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had offered was something rarer. Not just defiance, not just dissent. She had offered a frame. That war without accountability is not strength, it's spectacle. And spectacle without scrutiny becomes tyranny in disguise. And as the cameras rolled and the nation argued, one thing was certain: she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. It came without a return address, just a thick envelope, hand-delivered to her Capitol Hill office. The staffer who opened it first saw the jagged handwriting, then froze. 2 words stood out immediately, scrawled in red ink across the top. "You're next." Security protocols kicked in. The office was cleared. The sergeant-at-arms arrived. Gloves, scanners, silence. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't flinch. She read the letter herself, standing under the soft yellow light of her office lamp, as if absorbing the venom would help her understand the sickness behind it. The words were unfiltered rage, violent, graphic, precise. The author didn't just threaten her life. They threatened what she stood for: dissent, oversight, truth. And it wasn't the first letter. But this one was different. This one had her mother's name in it. For a brief second, the air turned heavier. Her staff waited for a signal. Should we go dark? Pause appearances? Call it in to the press? But AOC just looked up, eyes locked forward, and said, quietly but without a tremble, "If truth costs safety, I'll still pay the price." That line would be repeated later by news anchors, printed on protest signs, turned into TikTok audio. But in that moment, it wasn't a performance. It was a vow. Because the truth was, this letter wasn't really aimed at her. It was aimed at the echo behind her voice, the rising chorus of those who had found courage in hers. It was meant to send a message: stay silent or pay the price. But Ocasio-Cortez had already paid the price long ago. She had paid it walking into Congress with student loans still active. She had paid it in every viral clip where her tone was mocked, but her logic never matched. She had paid it the night she walked home in the dark, looking over her shoulder because she dared to say the words. War is not a campaign tool. The media learned of the threat the next morning. Fox downplayed it. Public figures get hate mail all the time. MSNBC gave it prime airtime. CNN brought in a behavioral analyst. But to AOC, the noise was secondary. She had already moved to action. Security was tightened. Her team underwent a threat briefing, but she refused to cancel her next appearance. A town hall in a military-heavy district where opinions were mixed and tempers ran hot. That night, she stood behind a plexiglass barrier, yet her words pierced through it like lightning. I know some people believe I should be afraid right now, and maybe I should, but I am more afraid of silence. I am more afraid of a country where truth hides behind fear, where questions are seen as attacks, where oversight is treated like treason. The crowd, uncertain at first, broke into applause, and back in her office, taped above her desk, was a copy of the threat, marked, sealed, and preserved. Not out of pride, out of principle, because the letter had done something its author never intended. It clarified the stakes. This wasn't just a political storm, it was a moral reckoning, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had made her decision. She would walk forward, not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. It arrived at 3:17 a.m., an encrypted file sent from a burner email address to the inbox of a progressive investigative journalist known only by his pseudonym, Pennsylvania Blue. No subject line, no greeting, just one PDF attachment. Title: Strategic Timing Analysis, Operation Falcon Strike. Within 5 minutes, the file was decrypted, verified, and read aloud on a private signal call with two members of Congress. One of them was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She didn't blink, didn't interrupt, just listened, one hand pressed to her temple, the other scribbling words so sharp they might have cut through stone. When the voice finished reading the memo's final line, "Late June optics optimal for domestic approval spike," she whispered. They timed a war for a pole bump. The document was damning, not in its tone, which was sterile and bureaucratic, but in its precision. Page after page broke down the calculus of perception. U.S. media cycles, voter sentiment algorithms, target demographics for military success. One slide had a heat map of swing state media impressions, post-strike scenarios. Another chart tracked approval ratings for wartime presidents across 50 years, with bold arrows pointing to a red highlighted forecast. Trump plus 4.6%, projected post-precision strike, minimal troop loss. This wasn't strategy. This was showmanship dressed in blood. The leaker was anonymous, but credible, a former National Security Council analyst who had quietly resigned 2 days after the strike. His message attached to the leak was one sentence long. "I took an oath to the Constitution, not a campaign." The memo hit Capitol Hill like a lightning bolt to dry brush. Within hours, it was verified by two independent journalists and confirmed as authentic by a former DoD official live on MSNBC. Hashtags exploded. Workshasha Memo Gate, Shasha Strike for Votes, Shasha Jana, Late June Optics. Fox News tried to dismiss it as a deep state plant, but the PDF was already public. So were the metadata tags proving it originated from within the West Wing. AOC moved fast, not loud, not theatrical, strategic. She scheduled a press conference for noon. No teleprompter, no notes, just the memo in one hand and the Constitution in the other. She didn't quote Trump. She didn't need to. The documents did the talking. "I stand here," she said, holding up the printed memo, "as a member of Congress sworn to oversee the balance of power, not to tiptoe around it. This isn't about party, it's about principle. If launching missiles becomes a campaign strategy, then democracy is already on fire." The footage went viral in under an hour. News anchors paused. Retired generals called in. Veterans posted furious TikToks. One said, "I didn't serve so a president could treat my oath like a marketing stunt." But inside the White House, the reaction was cold, calculated. One advisor was heard muttering on an open mic, "We've ridden worse storms." But not this one. Because for the first time, the public wasn't just hearing theories. They were seeing receipts, grayscale slides printed on White House letterhead showing that war was never about defense. It was about distraction. AOC didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She didn't have to. The country was listening. And she knew what came next wouldn't be about headlines. It would be about history. At precisely 7:42 a.m., the Capitol dome caught the first golden rays of a tense Washington sunrise. Just as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped into the Speaker's antechamber holding two things, a printed copy of the leaked memo and a resolution draft titled Emergency Briefing on Executive Military Action. Article 1 Authority. Her voice calm but her message thunderous. "We don't get to ignore this. By 9 a.m., her request was formally submitted, urgent, procedural, and constitutional. A classified congressional briefing to compel White House officials and national security staff to testify under oath. Not in prime time, not for cameras, but behind closed doors where legal consequences could pierce through spin. The backlash was instant. Within 30 minutes, GOP leadership convened an emergency huddle of their own. Jim Jordan slammed his hand on a folder and called it a political circus. Marjorie Taylor Greene posted a video in front of the Capitol steps calling AOC a drama queen in high heels. Fox and Friends ran a chyron, AOC weaponizes war. But the procedural reality was not on their side. The War Powers Act, dusted off and cited with surgical precision, gave Congress authority to demand answers when the executive takes unilateral military action without prior consultation. And AOC wasn't quoting feelings. She was quoting law. When the Rules Committee tried to stall the resolution, she walked straight into the hearing room, eyes locked on every face, and said, "If transparency threatens your strategy, maybe your strategy isn't patriotic." The room fell silent. Then, one by one, Democratic colleagues began to nod. Even some independents and 2 moderate Republicans leaned in. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about precedent, and history doesn't forget who flinched. By noon, the motion passed. A classified session was scheduled for 7 p.m. Outside the Capitol, it didn't take long for the streets to swell. What started as a few dozen college students with handmade signs turned into a crowd of thousands. Veterans in uniform jackets, mothers pushing strollers, retirees holding hand-drawn copies of the Constitution above their heads. The chant that echoed loudest wasn't angry. It was resolute. Read the memo. Hold the line. Drone shots flew over the gathering. Hashtags ignited. # emergency briefing. Now, # this is what democracy does. Live streams from the Capitol steps pulled in over 6 million viewers within 4 hours. And through the crowd, one sign rose higher than the rest. You serve us. Start acting like it. As the sun set, floodlights lit up the building's columns and the air turned electric. Inside, lawmakers filed into the SCIF, sensitive compartmented information facility, with phones confiscated, expressions tense. AOC walked in last, flanked by 2 senior colleagues, memos still in hand. Security was tighter than usual. One Capitol officer, a Marine Corps veteran, leaned toward her and said softly, "Thanks for fighting like you mean it." She nodded. Not for the cameras, not for the record, but for something deeper, a line of accountability that had to be redrawn before it vanished completely. Inside the room, classified documents were laid out, timelines exposed, intentions clarified. What was once assumed, now verified. But outside, where democracy breathes in real time, the crowd didn't leave. They waited, because they knew the future wasn't being written in headlines anymore. It was happening in a room without phones, without press, without sound. And the woman who dragged that conversation into daylight, she wasn't blinking. She was listening. Because in Washington, truth doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it storms the gates. It began with a silhouette. The figure sat against a blurred-out city skyline, voice distorted, identity concealed. But what he said rang louder than any name. He knew what he said, and he meant it. There was no mistake. That was the strategy. The anonymous whistleblower had worked within the National Security Council. Until now, he had kept quiet. But watching the memo leak, hearing the denials, seeing the smears, it had reached a point where silence was betrayal. In an exclusive interview with a progressive outlet, he laid out the timeline with forensic clarity. The hot mic wasn't just an accident, he claimed. It was the truth slipping through a crack. And that truth, now exposed, demanded action. Within hours, the clip of his voice, anonymous but unmistakably resolute, had gone viral. This wasn't about foreign policy, he continued. It was about optics, domestic polling, a midterm lifeline. The strike wasn't time for safety. It was time for ratings. Cable news erupted. CNN's primetime hour gave the full segment uninterrupted. Fox ran it with a red banner. Left-wing leak escalates chaos. But MSNBC brought in a retired general who, after watching the footage, said flatly, If even half of what he's saying is true, this is impeachable. Meanwhile, in her office, AOC watched from a tablet. The room was dim, papers stacked around her, aides silent. Only the flicker of screen light danced across her face. When the whistleblower's voice declared, "He meant it," her jaw tightened. She stood, adjusted her jacket, walked to the camera her comms team had just set up, ready to film her official response. No script, no teleprompter, just a gut full of fire and a heart that refused to yield. The red light blinked on. She stared straight into the lens. What you just heard confirms what so many of us feared. This wasn't a policy failure. It was a constitutional insult. When power is used to manipulate, to mislead, to manufacture conflict for political convenience, then we are no longer debating policy. We are confronting tyranny. Her tone sharpened, but her voice never wavered. Let me be clear. This whistleblower is not the story. His courage is not the threat. The threat is a system that rewards deception and punishes truth. That system ends today. Then came the line. The one that would dominate every social feed, headline, and late-night monologue for the next 72 hours. History is watching, and I intend to give it something worth remembering. She paused. Let the silence sit like a challenge. Outside the window, protesters gathered, some holding candles, others hoisting placards that read, "Truth has a voice." Inside, AOC handed the footage to her aide. Post it, everywhere. By midnight, the internet was ablaze. Millions had watched. Millions more shared. He meant it. Our history is watching. Whistleblow for democracy. The message was clear. The line had been crossed. And this wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. The clock in the rotunda read T-minus 27 hours to the House vote that could fracture a presidency or a party. Every hallway in Capitol Hill pulsed with whispers. Staffers clutched folders to their chests like shields. Phones buzzed nonstop. Behind every closed office door, something was shifting. Some were wrestling with conscience, others with calculation. At the heart of it all stood a woman who had once slung cocktails behind a Bronx bar. Now she was slinging truth with lethal precision, and every floor meeting she entered felt like a seismic aftershock. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't bargaining for attention. She was bargaining for a future where unchecked power wouldn't be shrugged off as strategy. Her team had mapped the numbers. The resolution sat on the edge of a blade. 216 votes for, 216 against, with 3 undecideds holding the fate of the republic in their hands. And those 3, all Democrats, all from swing districts, all terrified. Congressman Louis Whitaker of Ohio paced his hallway, sweat lining his collar. A week earlier, he declared himself deeply troubled by the leaked memo, but said now isn't the time to divide the country. But tonight, the country was already divided, between courage and complicity. In room 227, AOC met him behind closed doors. No press, no cameras, just 2 Americans and the weight of 330 million souls between them. She didn't come with threats. She came with stories. She told him about the letter from a Gold Star mother who said her son died, defending the Constitution, not a campaign strategy. About a teacher in Arizona who played the impeachment hearings for her 10th grade civics class and ended the day in tears. They asked me if integrity still mattered, she said. I didn't know what to say. When AOC finished, she didn't beg. She stood, met Whitaker's eyes and said, "What you vote tomorrow will outlive your term, but it might just define your legacy." Down the corridor, backroom deals were unfolding at full throttle. One moderate was promised a new chairmanship, and another was offered campaign funds from a centrist PAC. Fox News leaked a memo alleging AOC was secretly coordinating with the DNC, a claim that unraveled within minutes but left a smear just long enough to sow doubt. The Capitol cafeteria stayed open past midnight. Reporters camped in corners, capturing nothing and everything. The buzzword of the night? Optics. But what nobody could script, what no pollster could predict, was what played out in the human soul when silence was no longer safe. At 3:27 a.m., AOC walked the rotunda alone. A cleaning crew passed her, surprised to see her still in heels. One janitor, an immigrant from Honduras, quietly handed her a small folded note. Inside, 3 words written in Sharpie: "We see you." By sunrise, every network had countdown timers. NBC's Chiron blazed. Impeachment resolution. Hours to destiny cable panels melted down. Hashtags roared. Sharpie vote for truth. Shock history in motion. See, the mic was still on. At 10 a.m., the Democratic caucus convened for final deliberations. No phones, no tweets, just raw, unfiltered democracy. And there she was, seated in the third row, spine straight, eyes forward. Not a speech, not a spectacle. Just a woman who knew that when power fails, purpose must rise. Outside, a storm brewed. Inside, history ticked toward reckoning. And the world was watching. The House chamber was tense, packed, and so still it felt like the walls were listening. The speaker tapped her gavel once. The floor recognizes the gentlewoman from New York. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose slowly, no papers in hand, no teleprompter, just her voice, and the full weight of a nation teetering on the edge of reckoning. Her eyes scanned the room. Some stared back with folded arms. Others leaned forward as if the truth might whisper straight from her breath. She began, "I did not come here to be comfortable." No thunder, no theatrics, just that one sentence, and the air cracked. She continued, each word chiseled with urgency. "I didn't come here to protect a party. I came to protect a promise. The promise that our Constitution is more than parchment, that it breathes through our restraint, through our oversight, and through our courage when power forgets its limits." The chamber stirred. Cameras clicked. Networks cut live. Hashtags ignited before she reached her second paragraph. She didn't name the president. She didn't need to. The gravity of the strike, the leaked memo, the 7 words, the scandal swirled silently behind her like smoke behind a spotlight. She turned toward the Republican side of the aisle. "I've heard the word reckless used in private. I've heard irresponsible, even cowardly. But when the cameras roll, those same voices go mute. That silence isn't strategy, it's surrender." Then she pivoted to the heart. "To every veteran watching, you did not risk your life so a president could use missiles to spike poll numbers. You stood for values, not vanity. You swore to defend a constitution, not a campaign calendar." To the teachers, "I see you in classrooms explaining checks and balances, only to watch politicians gamble with war like it's spin the wheel." And then her voice softened. "To the little girl watching this from the Bronx, where I once sat wondering if anyone in power even saw us, I see you, and I'm here to tell you, truth matters more than fear." A murmur rippled through the chamber. A Republican congressman tapped his pen against the desk. A Democrat in the back quietly wiped his eyes. She raised her hand gently, not to silence, but to summon something higher. "This vote is not about left or right. It is about whether we still believe the law applies to everyone, or only to the powerful. Whether we still believe the people own this democracy, or whether it's been auctioned off to ego and expedience." Her voice grew sharper. "If we can't call a political strike what it is, then why pretend we're a co-equal branch? If we can't defend the Constitution when it's under fire, then why did we swear that oath?" She paused, then delivered the final blow. "If we vote no today, then tomorrow we bury the very document that gave us this room." For a moment, nothing. Then a slow rise, first a clap, then a standing wave. Dozens stood, others refused. The chamber was split, but the country was awake. And outside, the people heard not just a speech, but a signal. That the fight for truth hadn't been forfeited. That someone still had the mic. The House chamber had never felt so heavy. Reporters lined the back wall, whispering into phones. Pages moved like shadows. Phones buzzed in pockets. The tension was thick enough to slow time itself. And at the front, beneath the Capitol dome, history hovered, uncertain, breathless, waiting. AOC sat upright, eyes locked ahead, jaw set. She had done everything, laid out the facts, ignited the moral spark, and exposed the political games. But the arithmetic was brutal. The resolution to censure Trump for politicizing a military strike stood at 216 votes, just one short of the simple majority. All eyes turned toward the centrist Democrat from Pennsylvania, a former prosecutor, now a swing district congressman who had remained publicly silent through every news cycle, every press ambush, every viral video. His office lights had burned deep into the night, but no statement had emerged. The party didn't pressure him, they pleaded. Now he stood, slow and deliberate. The clerk froze. AOC didn't blink. The speaker asked once more, "How does the gentleman vote?" Silence. He looked toward AOC, not defiantly, not theatrically, but with the expression of someone who had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "Yeah." The chamber exploded. Reporters lunged for cameras. A wave of gasps and shouts surged across the floor. Someone from the gallery yelled, "Yes!" and was swiftly escorted out. But the sound had already landed. The count was final. 217-215. The resolution passed. Outside the Capitol, where protesters had held their ground for days, the reaction came like a thunderclap. Flags shot upward. A roar rolled through the streets, rattling through camera lenses and congressional windows alike. Back in the chamber, AOC didn't celebrate. Not yet. She let out a breath so deep it seemed to empty the months of pressure that had built in her lungs. Then she stood, straight-backed, composed, but in her eyes, vindication, not just of her, but of the Constitution itself. Fox News went dark for 40 seconds. Technical error. CNN's Kyron blazed. One vote turns tide in Trump strike scandal. The congressman from Pennsylvania turned and left the chamber alone. He didn't stop for cameras. Later that night, he'd issue a 3-line statement. War powers are not campaign tools. The Constitution is not optional. My vote reflects both. But in that moment, it wasn't his voice that echoed. It was AOC's. From a floor speech that would be replayed a million times before midnight. From her interviews, her unshaking posture in committee, her whispered notes in a dim apartment weeks ago. Every beat had led here. Staffers hugged behind closed doors. MSNBC cut to interviews with constitutional scholars. Hashtags exploded. One vote in Taj the Mikwasar, still on, began trending globally. And in a quiet Capitol stairwell, away from the cameras, AOC paused by a window. She watched as the crowd surged below, some waving flags, others holding signs that simply read, "Thank you." She whispered, not for effect, not for anyone else, just for herself. "We're not done yet." Then she turned and walked back into the building. Not toward the end of a battle, but the beginning of the next one. It was the winter of 2008. The glow from an old television flickered across the narrow walls of a modest Bronx apartment. Behind the bar, a young woman with fire in her eyes paused mid-pour. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez wasn't a congresswoman yet. She wasn't a symbol. She was a bartender, just a daughter of the Bronx, working night shifts to help her mother pay off debt after her father's death. Her hands were calloused from late nights mixing drinks, but her heart burned with the untamed fire of justice and purpose. That night, as Barack Obama stepped onto the stage to declare victory, the noisy bar fell eerily quiet. Alexandria stood still, breath held. And when he said, "Yes, we can," she didn't hear a slogan. She heard a summons, a message aimed straight at her, a woman of color, born to working-class parents who had been taught that politics was for people born into privilege. Tears streamed down her face, not out of simple emotion, but transformation. Something cracked open. It wasn't just a historic win, it was a torch passed. That night, behind a sticky bar counter lined with empty beer mugs, Alexandria began to write the first lines of her own political story. It didn't begin with a campaign. It began with conviction. In her weathered notebook, she scrawled the words, "If no one will speak for us, then I will." She didn't know what that path would look like, or how treacherous it would become. But she knew silence was no longer an option. Years later, standing on the House floor, she would still feel the weight of that night. Every time a colleague scoffed at her, every time a headline mocked her for being a bartender with opinions, she remembered the lessons that job had taught her, how to read people, how to hold her ground, and how to turn confrontation into conversation. Not with ego, but with truth. She never forgot what her mother endured. scrubbing other people's floors so her daughter could study. She never forgot the cab drivers, teachers, janitors who told her, "Don't become like them. Be the one who changes the game." Every step she took in the Capitol was layered with that memory. The polished marble floors might have echoed with tradition, but her footsteps carried a different rhythm, one born in the streets of the Bronx, shaped by survival and driven by justice. Back in that bar in 2008, nobody would have guessed she would one day rattle the foundations of American power. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't wait for permission. She created her own seat at the table, pulled it up with both hands, and dared the world to listen. That moment with Obama didn't just awaken her, it rewired her. She saw with painful clarity, change doesn't come when you wait your turn. It comes when you take the mic, even if your voice shakes, even if they try to cut you off, even if the world calls you too young, too radical, too loud. Because what they call too much is exactly what the moment demands. And that's why, when the nation later trembled over 7 words from a hot mic, it was no coincidence who stood up first. That fire, born in a Bronx apartment, sharpened behind a bar, ignited by hope, was never just for show. It was the beginning of a revolution. The roar of the Capitol had faded, but its echoes clung to her skin like smoke. It was just past midnight when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped back into her D.C. apartment. No cheering crowds, no press, no staff, just silence. The kind of silence that stings after battle. She slipped off her heels, each step heavier than the last, and dropped her coat onto the chair beside her tiny kitchen table. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the room, a jarring contrast to the thunderous applause and rage she had walked through hours earlier. She opened her phone. 67 voicemails. The first was a woman crying. "Thank you," she whispered. "I watched my son go to war. I didn't know anyone in that room remembered us." Another, a man's voice trembling. "You stood alone, but not really. We're with you." Then the shift, a growl in the next message. "You're a disgrace to this country." Another, "Go back to the bar, girl. We don't need your kind in power." And then came the static, laced threat. "You won't make it to re-election. Enjoy the spotlight. It won't last." She stared at the phone. Not with fear, with focus. This wasn't new, but tonight it cut deeper, not because it was worse, but because the stakes were finally real. A single vote, a single voice, and she had used hers knowing full well the price. She turned to her journal, a leather-bound thing worn soft at the corners. Its pages bore the weight of years, frustrations, strategies, scraps of speeches, quiet prayers. She flipped to a blank page, hands still trembling. And then, without overthinking, she wrote, "Somewhere a girl just saw what's possible." That was the point. Not the applause, not the venom, the ripple, the possibility. She poured a glass of water and leaned against the window frame. Outside, Washington slept. But she didn't. Not yet. Not when history was still humming in her bones. The vote had passed by one. Just one. And if she hadn't stayed loud, hadn't dared the room to sit in silence with the Constitution, would it have? She didn't know. Maybe it was ego to wonder. Maybe it was duty. Either way, she hadn't come this far to be timid. And yet the loneliness pressed in. The kind that doesn't come from being physically alone, but from knowing you were never supposed to make it this far. That the systems around you weren't built with you in mind. That the very act of standing your ground was seen as rebellion. She walked over to her bookshelf, ran a finger across the spines of Baldwin, Chavez, Angelo. All of them had known this moment too, when courage crests and the room goes quiet, when allies retreat and enemies advance, when your truth is branded as trouble. But still, you speak. AOC sat down at her desk and clicked open her inbox. A message from a school in Queens blinked at the top. "Our 7th graders watched your speech. One said she wants to be you when she grows up." She exhaled, deeply, fully, not for relief, but for resolve. That's why she came back to the empty apartment. That's why she kept the journal. That's why she kept speaking, kept showing up, even when it was easier to stay quiet. Because somewhere out there, someone was watching. And maybe, just maybe, they'd be brave enough to speak next time too. This wasn't about her anymore. This was legacy, and legacy demanded sacrifice. The dawn of public praise came quietly, almost as quietly as the footsteps of those who once doubted her. 5 days after the vote, a former skeptic delivered a short speech on the House floor. He had been part of the faction that called her tactics showboating and grandstanding. But this time he spoke with something new: admiration. Today, he said, we witness not just conviction, but the birth of a stateswoman. His words ricocheted across news tickers and social platforms. AOC, from protest to power. She watched the clip from her office, sunlight framing her head like a silent halo. She didn't beam. She didn't celebrate. She simply held her breath and let the moment settle. Meanwhile, messages poured in: handwritten letters, emails, videos from teachers and veterans, activists and students. Among them was one from a 12-year-old girl in rural Minnesota. It arrived in a plain envelope, tattered around its edges. Inside, on a painted note card, rested a small handmade bracelet, interwoven threads in red and blue, with 3 painted beads spelling courage. Alexandria cradled it like she'd just been handed a medal. She traced the letters with her finger. She didn't post it for likes. She didn't tweet it for applause. She slipped it onto her wrist, then said softly, only to herself, let's keep going. Because for every doubt silenced, for every voice lifted, there were miles yet to travel. There were families still living paycheck to paycheck, children still squeezing textbooks under lamplight in immigrant households, and there were halls filled with colleagues more concerned with optics than obligation. AOC stood and looked out over the Capitol lawn, grass still damp from morning dew. A few protesters lingered, holding their signs with quiet pride. Veterans in baseball caps, students clutching phones to capture every moment. They'd gathered not for spectacle, but to witness substance. When she re-entered the chamber that afternoon, the mood had shifted. Lawmakers greeted her, not with nods of grudging respect, but with direct eye contact. Some still disagreed, others simply stood and raised their coffee cups in salute. She had become not just a figure of controversy, but someone sliding across the spectrum into genuine admiration. Media pundits debated the change on panels. On NPR, one commentator framed it as a rare example of principle cutting across partisan lines. On CNN, anchors replayed the stateswoman's floor speech alongside historical footage of landmark congressional stands, from Chisholm to King. Your stateswoman AOC trended, followed by Yushaka courage bracelet and power in purpose. Through it all, AOC rarely spoke publicly. She let the people's voices, letters, voicemails, childhood postcards do the storytelling. But those close to her noticed subtle shifts, the more measured tone in her speeches, the inclusion of veterans and educators in her strategy meetings, the call to her staff each morning. We act for the next generation, but she never lost the spark. It was still there in her walk through the halls, in the way she paused to hear a constituent's story, in the way she'd call her mother midday just to say, I did it. I hear you, she told the girl who sent the bracelet, and I carry your courage with me. Not perfect, not unafraid, not undefeated, but unyielding. Politics is often described as the art of the possible, but sometimes it's the pursuit of what is right. Because behind every headline, every tweet, every scathing rebuke or quiet nod, there are people. And people need to know that courage still looks and lives in the public square. So she kept going, not for fame, not for power, but for promise. The promise of possibility, the promise of progress, the promise that the mic remains on and truth remains alive. And as cameras rolled out state, as voices clamored for the next move, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez returned to her desk, placed the courage bracelet next to her laptop, and whispered to herself, and to all who watched, let's keep going. Because power isn't verdict, it's commitment. And she was just getting started. The marble floors of the U.S. Senate echoed with history as the first gavel fell. A nation held its breath. These weren't just hearings. They were the reckoning. Televised live, streamed globally, and dissected on every platform from TikTok to PBS. This was political theater with constitutional consequences. The chamber was packed. Cameras tracked every blink, every shuffled document. C-SPAN's stream crashed within minutes. Viewership numbers surged past Super Bowl metrics. Even gas stations had the hearings on. America wasn't just watching, it was absorbing every second. At the center, the question that had divided households, split alliances, and redefined leadership. Did the former president manipulate military power for political gain? Trump's legal team arrived in formation, suits sharp, tone sharper. They leaned into their defense with fervor, national security, urgency, decisive leadership. They painted their client as misunderstood, misquoted, misrepresented. They cited emergency protocols, obscure memos, and fragmentary intelligence. But they couldn't rewrite timing, and timing, as the leaked memo proved, was damning. Clips of the late June optics optimal line played on repeat. CNN displayed it in bold. MSNBC overlaid it with a calendar. Fox, scrambling to reframe, focused on intent versus perception. But the nation had already latched onto one word, optimal, as if justice could be scheduled for ratings. And then came the surprise. A subpoenaed intelligence officer confirmed under oath that alternative options were available. De-escalation, he said, was recommended and ignored. A sharp inhale swept through the chamber. Phones buzzed across America. The hashtags number hearings begin and number power and play dominated every feed. Through it all, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat in silence, on the edge of her seat in the House gallery, her notepad already 3 pages deep. This wasn't her fight alone anymore, but the fire she lit now burned across both chambers. Analysts replayed her floor speech. Students cited it in civics class. Veterans nodded along, quietly mouthing words she'd spoken about sacrifice and truth. Even international outlets translated her message, Constitution, not campaigns, into headlines in Berlin, Nairobi, and Seoul. Outside, the Capitol steps became a gathering ground. Protesters held signs. Patriots held candles. Chants of truth before power echoed into dusk. Local radio stations played nothing but expert commentary. It felt less like news and more like history unfolding in real time. And for those who once dismissed the process as theater, the silence in their circles grew telling. No snide tweet could undo the raw emotion on the faces of those testifying. No late-night spin could reverse the gravity of public trust snapping back into focus. But this wasn't just about one man. It was about what kind of nation America still claimed to be. One defined by party or by principle. In her apartment that night, AOC sat back, remote on the table, phone off. She didn't need updates. She had already felt the shift. The story was no longer about a lone congresswoman asking hard questions. It was about a country realizing those questions mattered. "Let the hearings begin," one anchor declared with solemn force. And across the globe, viewers leaned in. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. This was no longer politics as usual. This was accountability, live and uninterrupted. And it was just the beginning. There was no podium, no flag-draped backdrop, no fireworks, no fanfare. Just a single camera, a softly lit room, and one woman ready to speak to a nation, fractured but listening. At 8 p.m. Eastern, every major network cut in. No interruptions, no pundits. Just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, measured, centered, and unshaken, preparing to deliver the message that would echo long past airtime. The screen faded from black to focus. Her hands rested lightly on a desk. Her voice, steady as steel, cut through the noise with surgical precision. "This is not a moment for sides," she began. "This is a moment for sight, not left or right, but forward." No slogans, no applause, just clarity and conviction. Across dinner tables and dorm rooms, in firehouses and factories, people leaned closer. They weren't just watching. They were absorbing every word, because this wasn't a politician campaigning. This was a leader commanding a crossroads. "We cannot call ourselves a democracy," she continued, "if we allow silence to be traded for safety or truth for convenience." With surgical calm, she walked the nation back through the headlines, the unauthorized strike, the leaked memo, the whispers of optics over lives, and the wave of denial that followed. But then came the pivot, the turn that defined not just her speech, but her vision. This isn't about one man. This is about the muscle memory of power, the belief that accountability is optional if you're loud enough, rich enough, or scared enough. Viewers froze. This wasn't partisan. It was primal. Because deep down, every viewer knew truth has always been the first casualty when ambition goes unchecked. But, she said, voice dropping just slightly, we have another memory too, of people who didn't fold, of moments where the hard right things still got done. She listed teachers who defied censorship, veterans who stood against torture, whistleblowers who risked everything. She reminded the nation of its moral spine, not as a myth, but as a history worth living up to. And then she leaned in, just slightly. I'm not here to be a hero, she said. I'm here because a little girl in the Bronx asked her mom what would happen if no one said anything. Silence. Then she added, and her mom said, then nothing will ever change. Social media exploded. AOC final message and Power V's truth rocketed to global trends. Commentators abandoned scripts. Even political rivals, off camera, watched without snark. Because this wasn't AOC challenging America. This was AOC reminding America of what it claims to be. As she neared the end, her tone shifted again. Less steel, more soul. There will always be those who try to convince you that justice is radical, that compassion is weakness, and that questioning power is dangerous. But I promise you, truth is not the enemy of peace. Silence is. She looked directly into the lens, not with fire, but with faith. And if tonight you feel like you're just one voice, one vote, one person in a crowd too big to count, know this. Every great shift in this country started with someone who felt exactly that way. She paused in the moment swelling. So don't give up. Don't tune out. Don't sit back when it's time to stand. This democracy isn't theirs. It's ours. Then the closing line. Simple, unforgettable. It's not about left or right. It's about never letting power silence truth. Fade to black. No music, no credits. But across America, lights stayed on longer. Conversations deepened. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of doubt, belief flickered back to life. Because this wasn't just a speech. It was a turning point. And the mic was still on. They said the country was too tired, too divided, too distracted to care. That no one watches hearings anymore. That truth doesn't trend. But they were wrong. By morning, the polls spoke louder than any pundit. 62% of Americans, red states and blue, rural towns and urban cores, declared the congressional inquiry not just justified, but essential. Not partisan, not performative, necessary. That number didn't lie, it shouted. And behind it was something even louder, a pulse returning to civic life. Across classrooms in Denver, Atlanta, Des Moines, students formed circles, not for gossip, but for government. Teachers paused lesson plans to let kids ask, why does war need Congress's approval? What happens if the truth gets ignored? In a church basement in Wisconsin, the Sunday sermon wasn't about damnation, but duty. Veterans sat beside high school seniors. The flag hung silent. Then one Marine, now gray-haired and gravel-voiced, stood up and said, I didn't serve for anyone, president or politician, to go around the Constitution. Applause. In Philadelphia, in Oakland, in Amarillo, something was spreading. It wasn't anger. It wasn't protest. It was awakening. Cable anchors stumbled to catch up. Networks scrambled to frame it. Some called it a movement. Some a reckoning. But none could deny it. The people weren't waiting for Washington anymore. They were having the conversation Washington tried to bury. And at the center of it all, she kept walking. AOC didn't hold a press conference. She didn't tweet a victory lap. She simply returned to work. Past the metal detectors, past the marble halls, into a Capitol now shadowed by consequence. A small group of reporters caught her on the steps. One asked, did you expect this kind of reaction? She paused only for a breath. I expected people to remember they matter. Then she walked on. Behind her, the crowd began to swell. Not protesters this time, not critics, not cameras angling for scandal. Just Americans, some holding signs, Some holding children, many just holding space for something rare, hope. And then above them, hanging from a third-story window, unfurled by a group of interns who didn't ask permission, was a banner in bold, unmistakable letters. Integrity lives here. The camera found it. The networks followed. The internet made it immortal. In the days that followed, the vote would be dissected, the memo archived, the headlines shift. But something deeper remained. Parents brought their kids to community centers and said, "This is what standing up looks like." Teachers assigned speeches, not for style, but for courage. Sunday school lessons suddenly included the War Powers Act, and coffee shop conversations stopped revolving around celebrity and started circling back to accountability. It was never about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez alone. She knew that. It was about reminding a country that democracy isn't something you watch. It's something you wake up to. And in that final image, her frame small against the grand dome of the Capitol, wind catching the edge of her coat, the crowd lifting not just their voices but their vision, a new narrative had taken hold. Not of division, but of demand. Not of noise, but of truth. Not of power, but of purpose. Because in that moment, one thing was clear. The mic was never off, and America was finally listening. I remember watching AOC walk past that Capitol banner, "Integrity lives here," and feeling something shift. Not in her, but in us. It reminded me of moments in my own life when standing up meant standing alone, and how in those moments silence feels safer, but truth burns louder. This story wasn't just political theater. It was a constitutional earthquake. It asked us whether we still believe that democracy is a verb, something we do, not something we scroll past. And it answered with crowds, classrooms, churches saying, "We still care, we still choose courage." AOC didn't become a hero. She became a mirror, reflecting what happens when someone trades fear for purpose, and dares to do it live, in front of a nation ready to turn the page. This wasn't about left or right. It was about right versus easy, about whether integrity can still win in a world addicted to spectacle. And in a moment where it mattered most, the people didn't look away. So I ask you, what would happen if you stood up, even when no one claps? What truth in your life is worth speaking, even if the mic stays on? Let me know in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it today. If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.